shook the country. You'll hear from a former Kentucky teacher who witnessed the tragedy firsthand.
Welcome back to LAX 18 News at 4:30. Today marks 30 years since the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded during launch. Nancy Cox joins us in the LAX 18 newsroom with a look at what's in the works.
Can't forget where you were that day, one of those events. A Kentucky teacher who was a candidate to be one of the crew members on that doomed mission talks about what she felt when the shuttle blew apart as the world watched. Hear from her at 5. Then at 6, there were memorials, public and private, across the country and even in space today. The 30th anniversary of the Shuttle Challenger disaster. The most public service, of course, was at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where the shuttle launched on January 28, 1986. More from NBC's Chris Clapham.
After a half dozen delays leading up to it, the Shuttle Challenger launched into an unusually cold day for Central Florida. The 7 astronauts, families and friends, and plenty of others watched from the grandstand.
And it has cleared the tower.
But shuttle launches had become so routine by January of '86 that only one network carried it live for the country to watch. That is, until some 70 seconds into flight.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
Year-long investigations that followed would conclude cold weather caused parts of the shuttle to break apart, causing the explosion and the nation to stop in shock.
There's no limit to how far love can go.
The Challenger 7 were remembered at an emotional memorial service Thursday at Cape Canaveral.
Ronald E. McNair, Gregory B. Jarvis.
It included a special tribute to Challenger's most famous astronaut, who was supposed to be the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe.
At a time when many people would think only of the impending launch, Krista was taking care of a teacher's business.
There was even a tribute from those on NASA's latest mission, the crew on the International Space Station.
I'd like to just take a moment of silence and recognize the sacrifice of all those crew members and how their spirit and their legacy lives on in their achievement in space.
Achievements that followed the tragedy of 30 years ago today. Chris Clapham, NBC News.
As many Americans watched the Challenger tragedy unfold on television, one former Kentucky school teacher watched the chaos unfold in person. LAX 18's Joe Ducey has her story.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
We just didn't know what had happened.
Sue Darnell Ellis watched in horror as the doomed Challenger spaceship broke apart miles above the Cape Canaveral launch site 30 years ago today.
A plume of smoke, and the 2 solid rocket boosters fell off to the sides.
The shuttle was carrying 6 astronauts and 1 school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who is set to be the first civilian in space.
We were watching for parachutes. We were watching to see if somebody might have escaped.
McAuliffe was selected from 11,000 applicants for a spot on the Challenger crew through the Teacher in Space program. Ellis was a math and science teacher in Marshall County. She was one of 2 finalists from Kentucky who were almost selected to be part of the Challenger's crew.
Our expectations were grand for Krista to go into space and to teach lessons to students and to motivate students in math and science.
Ellis would eventually go on to work for NASA. She says though the crew of the Challenger tragically lost their lives, their work will always live on, and she's made a part of her life's work to make sure their heroic legacy will never be forgotten.
To make sure that the loss of life would project us forward.
Covering the news in Anderson County, Joe Ducey, LAX 18 News.
Yesterday on LAX 18 News at 5, we brought you the story of there were several memorials held across the country and even in space in memory of the 30th anniversary of the Shuttle Challenger disaster. 7 members of the Challenger crew died on the morning of January 28, 1986, when a booster engine failed, causing the Shuttle Challenger to break apart just 73 seconds after launch. Investigators concluded weather caused parts of the shuttle to break apart, causing the explosion. The Challenger 7 were remembered at an emotional memorial service today at Cape Canaveral. It included a special tribute to Challenger's most famous astronaut, who was supposed to be the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe.
At a time when many people would think only of the impending launch, Krista was taking care of a teacher's business.
There was even a tribute from those on NASA's latest mission, the crew on the International Space Station. A former Marshall County school teacher was in the crowd at Kennedy Space Center in 1986 and watched the launch. Today, she spoke to LEX 18's Joe Ducey about watching this tragedy unfold.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
The doomed shuttle carrying a crew of 7 broke apart miles above the Cape Canaveral launch site 30 years ago today.
A plume of smoke, and the 2 solid rocket boosters fell off to the sides.
Sue Darnell Ellis was a math and science teacher in Marshall County. She was one of 2 finalists from Kentucky who were almost selected to be part of the Challenger crew through the Teachers in Space program.
And I was always drawn to everything that had to do with NASA and space. They announced that there was going to be a teacher to go into space. I mean, I had people walk up to me and say, Sue, you need to do this.
Krista McAuliffe was selected from 11,000 applicants for a spot on the Challenger crew.
And we were in competition and in training all at the same time. They divided us into 4 groups, and I was in Krista's group. I mean, I look back and I have a picture of us sitting together. And
moments after the launch, there was an explosion and the shuttle burst into pieces.
We were watching for parachutes. We were watching to see if somebody might have escaped.
The tragedy resulted in a 32-month hiatus of the shuttle program. Ellis, who eventually went on to work for NASA, says the heroic crew left a mark on history and space exploration that will never fade. Covering the news in Anderson County, Joe Ducey, LEX 18 News.
Thanks, Joe. Hollywood star